I'm very pleased to have you all here with me today as we continue this endeavor, understanding ourselves and understanding the root of what causes a tremendous amount of suffering in people, which can include anything from being miserable, broke, having poverty, having addictions. And of course, this does include any kind of physiological illness as well as mental illnesses as well. And that is uh, some kind of seed planting in the subconscious mind that is calling for these conditions, calling for self mutilation, calling for the curse of perfectionism, calling for something. So, what this means is no matter how miserable, how broke, how lousy our life might appear to be, there's something deep down that is calling for that. And we have to understand that our subconscious mind, within it, there's a program running that is calling for these. And essential, it's as easy as going in and changing that program, which can definitely transform. And it's really the only way transformation happens is to become aware of these things, change them at a very deep level, and suddenly the perceptions we have and the capabilities we have completely transform. So I am your host, Dr. Gabe Roberts. This is the Subconscious Healer. Let's look a little bit closer at this wound that persists. Let's take a deeper look into this trauma. First, I want you to imagine this scenario. It's a beautiful spring day outside, sunshine, there's a slight breeze, and it's just a beautiful day with, beautiful trees, flowers starting to sprout, green leaves all over the place. And you can definitely tell that the spring has really come on. The season of winter is past, and this new echelon of season has really come upon it. And along with it, there's this excitement in the air. And along with this excitement is an upcoming weekend. This is a time in my life, years and years ago, when I'm taking my wife, Tiffany, and at the time, my very young baby girl, Aria, to pick up my children from my former spouse's location. I'm driving a Nissan Armada going down the road. We're all excited to go pick up my kids on this wonderful day and have a great experience outside, whether we're going to be camping in the yard or playing with water guns or, doing something, having a great time driving down the highway to pick my kids up. And suddenly a rock hits my windshield, a big rock, probably the size of a golf ball, hits the windshield. There's a loud thunk. And this is right after I pick my kids up, by the way. Pick my kids up, heading back home. I'm excited. All the kids are excited. My wife's excited. A rock hits the windshield. And at this moment, actually, there's no crack, there's no damage, there's nothing done to the car. You can't even tell. It's just a lucky scenario where the rock hits the windshield, bounces off, and there's no crack, there's no chip, there's no damage. But my body reacts. It becomes very tense. Uh, my face goes flush. I grip the steering wheel even tighter, and you can just feel inside of that Nissan Armada with all my young children and my wife next to me, just this ripple of anger just coming through and just saturating our vehicle. At this moment, it's fair to say that my brain, my nervous system, and all my physiological processes in my body were suddenly in the grips of a distant past that came from the earliest experiences of my life. You could say I went through a psycho emotional time warp that instantly, without a choice or any form of recognition, completely separated me from that beautiful spring day with my kids and just immediately squelched all that excitement that was in the air. Now, my wife leaned in quietly as I'm driving down the highway. My wife, Tiffany, leaned in and whispered to me, "Don't let this ruin the weekend with your kids." And of course, this was years and years ago, long before I understood these impacts of trauma, long before I, understood what was even going on. And the problem is, many of us live with that still today. We don't know how these wounds show up, how these imprints from trauma will show themselves, and they do so elusively that it escapes the radar of most people's awareness. And it does so much to the point that this is a common everyday occurrence for most people in our culture. In fact, a majority of the people downright downplay it, never even knowing what happened, never even understanding that it was a wound from the past. And again, not even understanding that its very presence even exists. So this is an example of what happened to me years ago. A rock hit in the windshield takes me out of an exciting day through a psycho-emotional time warp and instantly brings me into a moment of tension, tightness. You could just feel the ripple of anger within the car until my wife whispered that. And of course, it took me a little while. I started to kind of come out of it. I started kind of changing my breathing pattern. And by the time we got home, uh, a majority of it, not all of it, a majority of it had went ahead and passed. But make no mistake about it, my kids could all feel that. Now think back to a time in your life when you had something similar to that take place. And it's the very root of it is something that was a very early experience in your life, not necessarily has anything to do with the present context, or in my case, it had nothing to do with a rock hitting a windshield. So nowadays, those things just don't happen. Fast forward, you know, from that time until 2 years ago when I'm riding with my child, I'm riding with my son, and we're on the way to a fishing trip. And I had a rock hit the windshield again, and I laughed about it. I absolutely, my body reacted completely different. I laughed about it. And not only was it pleasing for me to see that reaction was just instantaneous, just kind of a laugh at it, but it was also very pleasing for me to have shown my son how much I've grown between the first incident till that incident. And that's one of the best things we can do as a parent is be the example for our kid. Did I traumatize my kids through this? Of course I did. Have I grown and learned and healed majority of my wounds? I'm going to say a majority because they will still show up once in a while. Now, it takes a true act of something hideous to even come remotely close to triggering me anymore. But I just do not allow it. I don't. Anytime something happens in my body similar to that description, I immediately dive inside, find that, and neutralize it. Because after all, it has everything to do with my internal world that's going to reflect my outer world, whether it be through our behaviors, our social habits, or how it directly influences, skews, colors, and filters all of our potential thinking about the world that surrounds us and our place in it. That's what trauma does. Like any injury, it will always hurt. It'll always hurt when it's provoked until that holographic imprint is properly healed. In the case of childhood trauma, often this wound is dealt to us at times when we are so young and neurologically malleable. Our brain and our neurology is not even mature enough to understand any verbal communication. Our brain is built from the bottom up, from the words of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And during this time, when our brain is built from the bottom up, that means the brain stem up. It's during this crucial time that it is actually forming how to respond to environmental cues and feedback from things that happen to us later in life. And that's essentially what happened. A rock hit the windshield. That was a response from the environment. My body formed an instant response to that. And that's just, we have to understand that's what trauma will do. Any wound that are etched in during these times of conception until around the age of 5 remain imprinted. And they do so on such a deep level of our nervous system, such as the areas of our brainstem, our spinal cord, and far beyond the scope of which any of our language centers or our spoken neurological centers have any access to. That's why this rock hit the windshield. My body reacted, and I had no recognition of even what was going on, but it was enough to be palpable in the vehicle that every one of my kids, including my wife, could feel that sudden burst of anger. And if you've read my book, you understand it's because we all have this energetic field around us, this torus field that's hooked to our proprioceptive nervous system. It works with our heart's nervous system, and it sends out the electromagnetic field that comes from our body that we can detect and pick up. That's why we can easily pick up the moods of people close to us without any kind of cues, without any kind of facial expression or anything else. This is simply how our nervous system's wired. And that's why my family could simply feel those changes within me years ago. And this was like 9 years ago or something, the incident with the rock. This means that the wounds that are imprinted during these crucial times when our brainstem is forming, when our earliest brain centers are forming from the brain up, okay, built from the bottom up, not from the brain up, from the bottom up. It's these stored areas in our body during when these wounds are imprinted that our body is basically areas that are inaccessible and out of reach to our conscious awareness, and certainly out of reach for spoken language jurisdictions. That's why many times for our deepest childhood trauma, when you're doing talk therapy, maybe it's okay to express things. Maybe it's okay to have someone to have some compassion for, lean on a shoulder when we need to. But that being said, uh, having being able to use spoken language to access these deeper imprinted wounds is impossible. So I'm not going to say it's impossible for us to heal from talking, but neurologically it doesn't make sense. And for many people, it takes, years and years and years and years of talking about things. And even then, it's basically consistent of just poking that wound and reliving that wound over and over and over. I invite you to think about a new way of thinking about this. This is what I do on a regular basis with people. People come to me. Just this week alone, I had probably my most traumatized patient this year, um, a young girl who was subject to sexual trafficking. Okay. And her first her first thing that she wanted, when I sit down with a client, one of the first things I ask them is, what would you like to see happen today? What would you, if there's a pattern in your life that you want to get rid of, if there's something that has plagued you for so long, if you have a Christmas list, what would be at the top of that Christmas list to get rid of today? Pain and fear were hers. And we went through, taking her mind takes us right to the moment of when that pain and fear was first etched in her early, young, impressionable mind. Then we did what's called a batch release, where we take 9,000 past versions of her. That's how many showed up. 9,000 times in her life has she felt that pain and that fear. And we took all of those past versions and established safety in all of them. Now, our entire session took about 45 minutes. And once we were through, she could no longer bring up any feelings related to pain or fear. 45 minutes of time. Now, I understand that might be hard for some people to swallow. And I know that it makes some therapists discomfort, that uncomfortable, that things that a person could carry for 20 some years can be completely resolved within, less than an hour, completely resolved, the wound fully healed. But that's just, I invite you to expand your mind a bit and understand that these traumatic wounds, how they operate, are fully reversible. And then through the process of neuroplasticity, your brain can actually rewire new connections. So you can actually heal those circuits that were maybe maladapted or under functioning from those early wounds, deep down from early experiences. So people that have bought my book and used the process of holographic deletion and holographic reframing, after time and a while, and they clear out their bucket list, they will start to sense that something in them is completely different. They don't get triggered as easily. They don't have, those wounds are no longer present. And I understand for people, just a lay person who's reading a book and perhaps watching the videos that come with it, getting rid of these wounds may be a little takes a little more time than maybe others, just depending on your specific load. But as you start to clear these wounds, you'll notice that getting triggered from the past, going through that psycho-emotional time warp instantly without a choice or any kind of recognition, you'll notice those things happen less and less and less. And that's an indicator that this wound that acts as a persistent psychic spontaneous state of self-hypnosis is getting canceled, getting cleared. The holographic imprint, those fragments within it are getting neutralized. This wound or trauma is basically a holding pattern. It's a holding pattern going on, a pocket of frozen consciousness that not only persists, but it also exaggerates our response to environmental or internal stimuli. And oftentimes it does so in the most highly inappropriate and perhaps disproportional ways. So, another side of the coin in understanding this is that your body is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's designed to protect you. So you have to understand this. And again, it's a holographic imprint. This comes from understanding the work of Dr. Carl Pribram, a neuroscientist from Stanford. He's the one that said the holographic nature of the very perception of how we view and perceive data is what originates the foundation for this overwhelming traumatic experience that we have throughout our lives that show up as these um, flashbacks, as these shows up as these triggers. And observing this through the lens of this persistent wound, observing life, observing our relationships, observing ourselves, everything, the dynamics of our life, we're doing so through this lens of a persistent wound. And that can determine whether we're capable of even generating rational thought at all. Because everything that we do is colored and modified through that lens. And everything that is entangled within our lives is now basically colored and modified and shifted through that. Okay. This means that childhood traumas that occur to us early on in life rear its ugly head and influences our closest relationships with our friends, our family, our our careers, our ability to move ahead, our bodies healing in certain ways, and it will rear its ugly head, causing all kinds of atrocities and mischief, just like it did for a rocketing the windshield that I just described. All of this, of course, happens beyond the scope of our dominant beliefs, thoughts, and memories, beyond what we're aware of. Okay. Peter Levine summarized this best. Conscious, explicit memory is only the proverbial tip of a very deep and mighty iceberg. So, conscious, explicit memory. Explicit has to do with recall, the ability to recall things, recalling your first car, recalling your first girlfriend, recalling prom night, things like that, recalling the first time you ever saw a ball game. Those are all explicit memory based. That means recall. Conscious, explicit memory is only the proverbial tip of a very deep and mighty iceberg. It barely hints at the submerged striata of primal implicit experiences that moves us in ways the conscious mind can only begin to imagine. And again, that's from Peter Levine. So let's explain this another way. Each moment that passes, your neurology, which includes your brain, your spinal cord, your proprioceptive nervous system, all of your intrinsic and extrinsic factors, processes tremendous amounts of information, 2.3 million bits of data per second, to be precise. And it is drawn in by your nervous system through your five senses. And this enormous amount of data is interpreted, and any potential risk is calculated, and it's all controlled by your subconscious mind. Everything from the wind blowing through the trees and causing them to sway back and forth to you hear neighborhood dogs bark, that rush of air that kind of contacts your face as you see a bus drive by, the muffled noise of crowded people surrounding you at a restaurant or a local coffee shop. That all includes 2.3 million bits of data flowing into your five senses, and yet you're only aware of 126 bits. That's 0.006%. So the human nervous system is one of the most magnificent and powerful electrical systems on Earth. And one of its inherent responsibilities is for keeping us alive. So our nervous system cannot possibly handle all that information at once. That's why, that's why so much of it is skewed, so much of it is modified, and it's shortened down almost like a transducer that you would see outside your house. One of the things that takes a tremendous amount of um, electrical current, amps and wattage through the power line, and basically shortens it down, breaks it down to a small amount, enough equivalent to run your hair dryer in your sink in your bathroom. So that transducer neutralizing, taking a tremendous amount of that powerful electrical current, neutralizing it down to a small amount where you can plug in a hair dryer and use, is similar to all the information that you've taken and how your mind filters and streams it down to a small amount that you're consciously aware of. Now, that bit you're consciously aware of is power hungry, of course, and it tells you in a very convincing way that it's in charge of your life and it determines whether things are right or wrong and how things are right or wrong. And yet it's just a small piece of it. So this is just a regular occurrence for people uh how people run and experience their life. So oftentimes these things are recorded. And again, your nervous system has this built-in keys to assist in surviving your survivability, and that's completely beyond your understanding. Your it's completely beyond your conscious awareness. And so, common occurrence for people are something that maybe everyone's experienced is, let's imagine if you eat a certain meal and that meal makes you feel sick after eating it, you'll automatically avoid that particular food. And this is a term referred to as conditioned aversion. Okay. And maybe you get food poisoning from something, but you know how consciously you might even miss that food, but subconsciously you're suddenly there's a, I'm not going to say there's a wound there, but there is an experience there that where it acts as though uh, you're you're just going to completely avoid that. Your subconscious mind has this way of protecting you. The same thing happens if a child touches a hot stove and his nervous system is designed to protect him. It captures everything within that millisecond of that pain, and it's similar to a bookmark, keeping that place in his life. His nervous system stores everything, and all of that 2.3 million bits of data that's associated with the pain, stores it in a holographic like imprint somewhere associated with that pain occurs in his energetic field. And it's similar to a pocket of consciousness. That's basically what it is, containing everything that happened in that moment. He touched the stove, and all of the information in a subconscious mind labels it as something potentially dangerous. This means the next time this boy grows into a teenager or a young man and he sees somebody turning on a burner of a stove, that holographic imprint is triggered. His body releases an assortment of warning signs, maybe a flashback of memory, a sudden burst of adrenaline, tightness, tension somewhere in the body, rapid pulse, and maybe even that pain at the initial sight starts to come back. So the subconscious mind does not use verbalizations. It does not use a language. It responds this way as an attempt to basically persuade to keep somebody from doing that same thing. So that's how it happens. Looking back at early childhood experiences, if there's a if there is if the events that happen to us early in our life are really heavy, they're they're overwhelming, we can have a tremendous amount of weight happen. That would be like the fracture. That means critical mass to where our subconscious mind perceptions get so overwhelming that it has to make whatever's happened to us into form, even if it's something negative. That can happen early. So um, there are people out there who have chronic symptoms that are unresponsive to certain ways, and it's under it. What you have to understand is deep inside of those symptoms, The mind is doing exactly what it's perceived to do. It's protecting the person. Let's take a look at two people who are really good at heart, and they're not planning to have a child, and they just don't even feel like they are equipped for such a responsibility. Maybe they don't have the funds, maybe they're early in their career, or maybe even in college. And yet these two young people get together, they let the hormones get the best of them, and then they receive news that there's a pregnancy. They receive news that suddenly she's pregnant. Now, initially, these people are terrorized. It's felt by all involved, including that growing fetus, just like my children felt my anger inside my uh, vehicle when that rock hit the windshield. So, but the difference is my children, even though they were, you know, young, very young, under the age of 10, they were not quite as absorbent as a baby that's in the womb. Okay. So when these two proverbial examples of people I'm talking about first receive the news that the pregnancy, they're terrorized, and it's felt by all involved. Immediately, they decide they can't deal with this right now, and they start having a discussion and thinking about abortion as a way out. But then let's say they calm themselves down and they think it over, and they decide they want to have the child and live up to the responsibility. Now, from this moment on, that fetus that fetus begins to feel heartfelt love. It starts to feel that it's welcomed. And now, instead of the perception of not wanted, a mistake, um, shouldn't be here, starts to get kind of replaced by newly planted seeds of love. And these can begin to get compounded, and feelings of worth are now what will start to develop in this growing fetus. So, if after that first negative input, the child is now showered with love and welcoming, the negativity will most likely become diluted, almost to the point where that initial seed planting, which could have grown into a calling for self mutilation, instead may remain dormant forever. The whole concept where this initial sensitizing event, or the very first wounding, happens to a child in the womb or between the first few years of life, and is compounded silently over time by secondary events until that calling for mutilation grows so strong that symptoms begin to develop, is best represented by the old saying, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, this saying that says when you put a lot of straw, tons of straw on the back of a camel, it's fine until you get to the point where it's so heavy that one single straw by itself, that's insignificant by itself, once it's added, it overwhelms the back of the camel, causing the camel to collapse. Well, that's how it works. That's how it works with the mind. This analogy gives us a point where a fracture occurs, and that's dependent upon the weight of the individual events and how frequent new ones are that compounds this. One of the scenarios that I tend to kind of go through with this is how you sense these things occurring is if you're going through life and a certain context happens, the first thing that happens is you have a body feeling. You have a feeling throughout your body somewhere. Usually, if, and in this case, we'll talk about a feeling that you don't like. Something shows up, a body feeling, then there's kind of an emotional cascade of kind of like an emotions start to come up, and then suddenly you have the dialogue running inside of your head. Well, many people focus on the dialogue running inside their head, and they might do some affirmations to try to combat it. Or if you see somebody and they do emotional clearing, such as body code, emotional freedom technique, etc., they're trying to clear those emotions out while completely ignoring that subtle body feeling. And that body feeling is an indicator that you hit a wound, and actually you just added more weight to whatever that perceptual wound was. That's just how that's the same as the straw that breaks the camel's back. Um, Whenever a person has these feelings show up in their body, it's an indicator that there was a wound inside of them poked. Now, let's just say, for example, a child is born from two parents, and the parents really don't want the child, but they have the child anyway. And this child's earliest perceptions, that start to build from the parents' inner overall energy is the child's too much to bear. They really didn't want him, but they bring him into the world anyway. Well, right away, this child doesn't feel wanted, doesn't feel welcomed, doesn't feel like there's a place in the world. And, by the age of 5, that perception is completely solidified, concrete. And let's say that this particular child begins to grow up as a young teenager, and maybe he's at 12 years old and he's playing dodgeball with a group of other peers at a school. And this particular child is the last to get picked on a team. So we've kind of all been there, but imagine that scenario for a moment. The last one to get picked on the team. Well, what happens when he's the last one to get picked on a team as a 12-year-old boy with peers? A body feeling shows up, a feeling that he's not good enough, a feeling that he's, not worthy enough, whatever it might be. Well, that body feeling is just a re-triggering of that wound that was already impressed on him earlier in his early experiences of life. However, that incident with not getting picked on the dodgeball team adds more weight to that initial wound. And that's why I'm talking about the straw that breaks the camel's back. We go through life and we keep adding more and more and more events that show up as body feelings in our life, adding more and more weight to that wound until eventually it builds up so strongly that the subconscious mind's goal achieving agency kicks in and starts to make whatever that perception is into form. And that's where symptoms start coming up. And if we could do a number of things for those symptoms, from getting chiropractic work to physical therapy, acupuncture, energy work, Reiki, all kinds of things, changing our diet radically, starting to exercise, starting to go out and walk, starting to try to do things to positively shift those symptoms. But if that calling is not addressed, if that wound is not properly neutralized, then it's all but certain that that perception will start to continue to grow stronger and stronger. And this means the symptoms will continue to show up in some way, shape, or form. So, in another scenario, we might find that that initial seed planting is only confirmed by secondary sensitizing events to bring shallow and sporadic symptoms or sporadic disease. This happens too whenever a person kind of goes through the ebbs and flow of life. Okay. So let me kind of go back for just a moment. The whole concept of this initial sensitizing wound is compounded silently over time by secondary events like the child not getting picked on a team until that calling for mutilation grows so strong that symptoms develop. And this is best represented by that saying, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And if they're allowed to accumulate over time, the burden becomes so increasingly unbearable that one last straw, as a seeming insignificant event, is loaded and everything gives way. That's the fracture. That's the last straw. That's the analogy that where suddenly a person has reoccurring symptoms that start to show up. And I mean anything from a headache to chronic constipation, OCD, anxiety, depression, anything you could name of, especially anything that you would go see a specialist for, whether it's a cardiologist or a dermatologist. Those are all events compounded to the point where they reach critical mass. Now, let's think of another scenario where we might see that initial wound that's confirmed through secondary events that bring shallow and sporadic symptoms about. So, life for this person kind of holds steady and maybe even does so for years, and they consciously think they're fine, they're okay. Maybe there's a run of hard times, they get stressed, and out of nowhere weird symptoms kind of start to show up. Then in the same weird way, things start moving forward for that person and the symptoms disappear. So things start to get better, the symptoms disappear. As the symptoms begin to kind of do this ebb and flow pattern this way, the nature of the sensitizing event is not really as relevant as how we handle the nature of the event. In other words, not all people that are witness to their own abortion discussions, their own abortion discussions, are going to get cancer. Okay. Again, that's the one that I see most often when it comes down to people that have chronic autoimmune, chronic illness, chronic disease. Um, what happens is when we ask our subconscious to take us to the seed planting, there is initial talk that the parents did not want to have the child. They didn't believe they're equipped for it. It could have even been a mother who had several miscarriages and she got pregnant. She goes, "Oh, not again. I can't do this. I don't want this. I don't want to go through it again." She's thinking that. Well, all of that information gets downloaded to the child and into the fetus, then into the child, into the infant. And those perceptions cause any kind of self worth to mutate very quickly. But not all people who are witness to their own abortion discussions or discussions of they shouldn't be around are going to develop illness. There will be some kind of symptoms. There will be some kind of something coming up. Similar events will have different effects on different people. Okay. So let me say that again. Similar events will have different effects on different people. One child, let's say, who is born into an alcoholic family will become an alcoholic. Maybe they become addiction prone. Maybe they don't have any drive. They don't really do anything with their life. Another child in the same family will grow to be everything different. Another could be a chronically ill and a last child, maybe a workaholic, a person who just drives themselves to work, never takes a day off, works over and over, is dedicated to their duty. They want to do the best they can. They don't want to be like their family, and they just never take a day off until they have a heart attack. And how can these scenarios be? Well, sensitizing events we learn through our regression to cause are very specific. What this means is when I regress a person, when I take them back to the seed planting, I focus them, I focus on their entire illness, their entire symptoms, their entire whatever it's a malignancy, and I ask their subconscious mind with pure intent, take me back to the event of significance. What's the event of significance? Now, to the mind, in seconds, takes me to an event that lasted on an average of 10 minutes out of the entire lifetime that person had. Now, that is very specific. Think about it. Their mind, within seconds, takes me back to an event that lasted on an average about 10 minutes out of their entire lifetime. That is extremely specific. Now, if sensitizing events are of this size, then even identical twins are likely to quickly pick up perceptions that were born of specific events, and these events are not necessarily common to both twins. And this is why, for all their genetic similarities, any neighbor or family member will always boast of their ability to kind of tell the twins apart. And what this implies is, although they may look alike, they are different people. And people who are close to twins can see those differences. So in the case of 4 children born into an alcoholic household, the overall energy of that household may be somewhat consistent, but each child will have moments unique to them, specific to them, and unlike anything the others may have experienced. And it's because of this fact that no two people can accumulate the same exact sequence of experiences. So their individuality is always guaranteed. This means that whatever it is causing their chronic illness, doctors certainly aren't going to find, therapists with talk therapy certainly are not going to uncover, and the individual themselves most likely is going to have no clue. So this is why I always tell my therapists and my doctors that I train on psychosomatic medicine, if you want to mess up a good healing session with your client, with your patient, go in assuming that you know where the problem is. The only source that knows where their seed planting came, that's calling for their symptoms, is their subconscious mind. You go anywhere else and you're wasting your time. Bankable.